Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thanks to those who tuned in before we actually went live and live in 2 weeks, Zaiba. Oh my gosh, this is crazy.
I know.
Welcome
What are
to
we
an
gonna do with ourselves?
I know,
Goodness,
once we
we're
learn
getting the.
something, we're gonna
I
beat it
know.
to death.
Yay!
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Momming While Muslim podcast with your co-hosts Zaiba Hassan and Uzma Jafri. This is Uzma. Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
And this is Zaiba Hassan. Assalamu alaikum.
So, we're going to talk today about fun stuff, but let's do our little recap of the short week that we had because we just saw everybody on Monday. But this weekend's the Women's March. Are you super excited?
I am so excited. Of course, it's been in the 50s and 60s here in the DC area, and tomorrow it's gonna freezing rain of all the
Yes.
days, right? So, but you know what? Women are tough. So we will just get bundled up and get the message across. We're very, very excited about going. My daughter and myself are going to go with a couple of friends.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Why is it so important for you to go? Typically, I don't take my kids to rallies. They're a little smaller and it's a little wilder out here in the West. So tell me why it's so important for you to get Zara to go with you.
Well, this is the first year she's actually attending with me. And she's attending with me on her own accord. I'm not one for projecting or putting my kids into situations that they don't necessarily feel comfortable with, or they don't necessarily agree with me on a lot of things, right? My kids have
Hmm.
different opinions on stuff, and that's kind of what we want. But this is a year where she is going to be 14 and she asked to join me this year, and I'm really excited. And the bonus is we've had Tara Ajay on our. The founder of the Love Glasses Revolution on our show before, and she has so graciously offered to send a bunch of love glasses our way. So we'll be rocking those
Woohoo!
heart-shaped glasses tomorrow at the march, and hopefully spreading the love. Because at our core, we are the center of our homes, right? And
Hmm.
for me, that's very important to show strong leadership to my daughter because they can do just the same amount of things that their male counterparts can. And I'm blessed that I have at least one daughter. What about you? Are you guys going to go, or what are you guys going to do this weekend?
Our activists, I'm not sure exactly what happened. They somehow dropped the ball. And so our march is not until Sunday.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I will be marching probably with Tara, because she usually has her
Oh,
big Love Glasses banner and
yay!
Love Rebel stuff. So I'll be rocking my Love Glasses. I usually
Yay.
go as a medic. So if there's any health issues, usually it's people getting dehydrated. We
Hmm.
haven't really had anybody get hurt at the Women's March, thankfully, in the past couple of years. So, and last year I think I even skipped out early because nobody got hurt. And yeah, so I carry my water, my medical supplies, and then if nothing happens, then I fall into line. But we didn't even get permitted to march this year because there's a marathon going on apparently.
Oh,
So all kinds of
no.
disasters. So we'll be standing and rallying and doing speeches and stuff, and that'll be that.
Well, that's really exciting. So I can't wait to see your pictures on our Mommy Well Muslim page. So let's get
Yeah.
our matching love glasses and be part of the revolution, ladies.
Yes, and make sure you guys check out our 10 days of giveaways today because in honor of the Women's March, we will be giving away love glasses thanks to Tara Ijai and Love Glasses Revolution.
Yay. So what's the soapbox for today? Because I think that's our new format. Like you
Oh,
tell us
yeah.
what's on our soapbox for today, Miss Uzma.
All right. So, if you guys saw the ridiculous videos of the formal articles of impeachment being delivered to the Senate to try the President of the United States, it is more of a ceremonial thing, but as certain newscasters pointed out, like you could have just emailed it, buddy. But apparently, they have to be taken to the Senate from the House of Representatives down the hall, and they have to be read aloud so that the president knows that he is being tried for impeachment. So here's the thing that I don't understand as a citizen. We know there are 67 Republicans sitting in the Senate in a body of 100, and it requires a two-thirds vote to impeach the president by the Senate. And 67, last I checked, I'm not good at math, but I believe is a two-thirds vote right there. So it's just lucky that that's exactly the number of GOP members sitting in the Senate right now. And so um, even though we have a president who has been confirmed from many sources to have threatened a foreign nation with withholding congressionally approved funds in exchange for dirt on his political rival, which is illegal or unconstitutional, if that means anything as an American to us. Either way, that's really clear. But we know that the Senate from his party is not going to impeach him. So, there's a lot of people that are super hopeful that in November 2020, things are going to change and that we're going to have a new president. But it looks really bleak, y'all. I don't think this guy's going anywhere. But the silver lining, because I know you're my silver lining girl, there are 34 seats, 22 of which are Republican held in the Senate that are up for reelection in November. So, like you pointed out a couple of episodes ago, that is the change we can make. That is what we need to focus on. So, as moms, our job is to look up our senators, the ones that represent us in DC, and figure out, hey, are those the guys whose girls or guys whose seats are up? How have they voted? What did they vote on impeachment? And if they didn't do what we wanted, we vote them out. That's the
Exactly.
soapbox for today.
And there's we will share the link where you can kind of look for that information and be informed on these types of issues because 2020 is a year of change and from my perspective a year of hope regardless of what happens in the presidency. So that's just something that we as moms within our family should definitely make it a priority to research some of these issues.
Perfect. You want to head into our topic for today?
So that is our soapbox for today. We're not experts by any stretch of the imagination, but we try to be informed. So we talked a little bit about love and marriage, the horse and the baby carriage. But now, what happens when the baby comes home and the baby is hangry? And there's so many different controversies over like breast is best. And the reality of the situation is from an Islamic perspective, and the actual science is fed is best, right? Like, however you choose to feed your baby. Is the blessing, but there are a multitude of choices, and we're going to just kind of get into feeding your baby once the baby is home. So, Uzma, you are a huge proponent for breastfeeding. And in
Hmm.
fact, you're going to be going to a breastfeeding conference in Tanzania. Is that what's going on right now? Can you please, one, explain to me who,
What the
what,
hell
where,
I'm
and
doing in
why?
Africa? Yeah.
Exactly. So you're going to Africa to do this breastfeeding conference.
Hmm.
Do you want to give us a little bit of insight as to what motivated you to do that and and why, how are you even going to get there, to be honest with you? Let's talk a little bit about
I'm
that.
gonna start swimming today, and maybe I'll make it over. So it's actually an internship, and it's clinical and didactic in breastfeeding medicine. And for 10 years, I've been saying I'm going to get my IBCLC, which is my certification in lactation. And I didn't do it. I kind of started in residency where I discovered this whole branch of breastfeeding medicine, and I found an expert who is like the local and now kind of an internationally renowned doctor, pediatrician who's also an IBCLC. And she was kind enough to take me under her wing and train me. And then, residency kept going on, and then I did fellowship because I really wanted to take care of old people, but I was also really interested in breastfeeding medicine. People were like, well, you have to pick either or. And I did. And I'm thinking now as I'm getting older, when is the best time? It's kind of like this podcast, right? How many people were like, well, what are you qualified? How are you qualified to do this? And are you sure this is a good time to do it? When is a good time to do something? I've been passionate about it. I put a lot of things on the back burner in lieu of motherhood, careers, not the perfect time. And I just figure while I still got my legs and while I still have a sense of adventure and my hips are still working, let me get them over there and go back and get some clinical hours. So I'm not sure exactly what I'm doing. I know I'm doing some lectures, taking them. Like I'm a student. And I think that as human beings, that's our job to be lifelong students and then getting my clinical hours, watching lactation consultants in the field, in an international field, who have to do this on a regular basis because formula is not accessible in third world countries. It is cost prohibitive for a lot of people, and babies die because of lack of water it's not just because of the lack of milk. You don't have clean water to clean all of the feeding supplies. So, relactating women in natural disasters, refugee situations is actually a really big movement to try to save some of these babies from dying of dehydration and diarrhea, which is the number one cause of them dying. So, learning to relactate and lactate moms in the third world, I think will really help me when I come back to the developed one.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I love that you're finally deciding this is something I've been thinking about and you're just going to go do it.
Yes.
You're literally going to Africa to
Hmm.
get this done. So I can't wait to hear about that adventure when you do go,
Yeah.
and to hear and read all about it. So the one thing I do want to say, and you made an interesting point that sometimes formula is just not accessible to people because it is a very cost prohibitive um, way to feed a baby. But sometimes you just can't help it and you just are not producing enough. So I have to say, by God's grace, I've never had that issue. I was essentially a cow, like for lack of a better phrase, and I can literally feed. I with my
A
babies, I could
nation.
literally feed. I could feed a nation, which is a blessing. So I never had
Alhamdulillah.
that experience per se, other than with my number three, who just had palate issues. So just to get latched on took a while, but then we were able to figure it out. But I have to give my sister-in-law, Nadia, a shout out because with her second, I remember watching this happen. Like she was having, my nephew was having a failure to thrive, and it was
Oh,
because of her lack of supply at the time, and we didn't really know this, but this woman was so dedicated to exclusively pumping, obviously having to supplement a little bit with formula as well and getting it done. I feel like sometimes that for me personally, it was just easier for me to nurse a baby than to go through that whole process of
back and
attempting
forth.
to nurse and the back and forth. And I mean, kudos to all the mamas that just try to get it done. So, did you have any issues, Uzma, with breastfeeding your kids, or like what was your experience with your children?
Um, yeah. So I'll talk about my first experience because that was
Probably the
like
hardest.
literally, I tell people I would rather have my bottom lip tied to a truck and dragged through a field of broken glass naked than do
Oh
that
my
again because
gosh.
it
Oh
was
my
so
gosh. That is such a
bad.
visual.
That is exactly what I said to tell people. If you think pregnancy and labor is hard without an epidural, wait until you start breastfeeding because it is tough.
And
But
by the
before
way,
I,
for it being
mhm,
such a natural thing,
mhm.
it's
It's
not
not
natural.
totally not natural.
You have
No,
to
no, no.
figure this out.
Yes. So before I do discuss what happened with my firstborn, I will say my caveat is I do not believe in fed is best because I think that's a fallacy of logic. Of course, feeding a baby is the best thing. Who would argue that not
Right.
feeding a baby is not okay? You know, like all of us want our babies fed. The argument over breast is best, that doesn't make any sense to me because all formula is trying to mimic breast. So breast is the standard. And as you said, it is not possible for everybody. But scientifically, medically, there's less than, I believe, 2% of women who actually cannot produce enough breast milk.
But okay, so
Um,
I don't necessarily disagree with you. And this is coming from a person like I literally nursed all my kids for 2
right,
plus and for some of them
right.
plus years. So I obviously believe in the concept of breastfeeding. Some
Mhm.
people just don't want to.
Yes, and I've
And
met
that's
those moms
okay.
too. Yeah, and that's okay. It's your choice. Again, it's your body, whatever you decide. For me, I was an intern, so that's first year of residency, working 80 hours a week. I was going to be away from my son for a very long
Long
time.
period.
So there's
Yeah.
a lot of guilt. Like if you think you've ever felt guilty for like, I don't know, whatever you felt guilty for, stealing, lying, kissing a boy, I don't know, like all the things that you thought were the worst kind of guilt that you've ever had, forget about it. Once you become a mom, that baby is guilt. So to deal with that mom guilt and being away from this part of my heart, you know, this part of my body that came out, I was like, well, the only thing I can give him while I'm away from anywhere from 12 to 34 hours at a time. like in blocks, I'd be away. So the only thing I could give him was breast milk because now he's going to daycare, right? So he's going to get sick and I needed to protect him. And I knew those first 6 months of breast milk, the reason why the guidelines are there for exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months is because that's when those antibodies are being fed into the baby through your milk. And so
Okay.
I really wanted my son to be protected and not be sick. I mean, he still had the sniffles pretty much the whole time he was in daycare until I pulled him out. But it was that dealing with the mom guilt. It was the Islamic mandate. So in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 233, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that, your children have a right over your breast milk for 2 years. There's an addendum to that, that if the mother or father choose not to breastfeed the baby, then the father has to go out and find somebody, compensate a milk mother or a milkmaid, I guess is the European
Literal
equivalent of that.
term. Yeah.
No, there's another, now I can't remember the term. But yeah, a milk mother, like Halima was for Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So, I feel like we have the best of both worlds as Muslims because we are unique in our religion in that we actually have a timeline, which guess what? Is consistent with the World Health Organization's recommendations of breastfeeding 2 years and beyond. So it's like, well, Islam had it figured out like 1500 years ago, but thanks who? Um, but at the same time, for those moms who cannot physically do it, Allah has this cushion for you already built in. So those were the two reasons why I did it and why I gave myself such a hard time. But I had a late pretermer, which meant my son was born at 37 weeks. And kids aren't always fully developed and they don't have the ability, the natural quote unquote ability to latch on and suck. And so he was very bad. And it sounds like your Z3 had the same issue as mine did. He has a Michael Phelps palate, so it's really high. It's kind of
Yes, that was
curved up
how
like
it was.
this.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
He was
And
a
I did
thumb
not
sucker
know
in
this.
utero.
Yeah. I didn't see that, and neither did the doctor, and nobody could figure it out. And it was miserable for 2 months. I had postpartum depression and psychosis. I was pumping to try to increase my supply because here's the trick. This is why I had to do that because I had many family members from both sides of my son's family saying ridiculous things like, Uzma has the baby with her all the time. She doesn't want us to touch the baby, which when babies come home, they cluster feed, and it's literally every 20 minutes this kid is hungry because he has this high palate. He's not drawing enough. My milk didn't come in because your milk doesn't come in until day 5 of life, which is exactly the way it's supposed to be. Because your baby stomach is this big. See, top of your thumb when he's born, that's a teaspoon. That's all he needs. And he wasn't drawing it enough. So now I'm pumping because I also have my mom saying, why don't you have milk? I had milk before I had babies. I don't understand. Da 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 da.
And when
You
it's
need to
your
give
first
formula.
kid, everything
Oh
is
my
so
God.
stressful because you
Yeah.
just don't have anything to compare it
You
to.
haven't
That's the issue.
slept in
Yeah, you're
days. Like
exhausted.
I hadn't slept more than 2 hours consecutively in 7 days and finally collapsed, physically collapsed, fell at my husband's feet. And I was like, I just can't do it anymore because I had people from all directions barking at me like, he needs formula. This formula is causing gas. That formula is causing diarrhea. This blah blah blah. And it's like, I know what I've told my patients. I know that 50% of it was wrong now that I've actually had a baby, and 50% of it I trust is still true, and I should know what I'm doing. I'm trying to get this yellow stool to come out of my son. It's not happening fast enough. He's orange. He was a jaundiced baby, so I knew that I had to get him to poop more to get him healthy and keep him from getting admitted to the hospital again. But it was just so stressful and so awful. So I did do formula, and once I went back to work, there was a lot of what I call breastfeeding sabotage. And people are really well meaning when they do it, or they just don't know any better. And behind your back, they'll feed your baby formula because they think he's hungry and you didn't leave enough milk for him. Because these are people who believe that a 3 month old has any business finishing more than 6 ounces at a time. I have come home and just in time, right? I didn't do my last pump in the car on the way home because I was like, I want to feed my kid at least twice at the breast once we figured out his palate issues. And I would pick him up, and Zeba, I would move him around, and I could hear he sounded like a water bottle,
The
the
sloshing
sloshing.
in the belly.
And,
Oh, poor
he'd
thing.
vomit. And I'm like, you can overfeed a baby. He's not losing weight. He's meeting all of his growth curves. Like, I don't understand. people wanna love on a baby by feeding him, and that's what I realized, and there's so many other ways that you can do it, and I tried to
Because
teach,
let's
but,
be
some
honest,
people are
it's
just
really boring
unteachable.
with babies when they first come home. Really, you're
It is.
just feeding them.
Changing diapers and feeding them,
But
that's all it
babies are
is.
boring. You've heard it from me here now. I'm not a baby person.
I totally am. I could have them sitting inside of my shirt all day
Oh,
long,
no.
no problem.
No, thank you.
Yeah, once
Will
they
not be
start
doing
moving,
that
rolling
again.
over, not interested.
Give them to me when they're 2 and above, I'm in. So, like, I'll let you have the baby and
No.
then you give them to me. Like, let's make a
Yeah.
pact for that.
We so should have had babies together. We didn't make our pact early enough, that's our fault.
We
Yeah.
didn't, but, we're getting sidetracked now. That's the
Yeah.
unfortunate
Let's
thing when
talk
you go
about
live.
Z4. Let's
Yes,
talk about
that was an
Z4
issue.
because
Okay.
I have treated babies in the NICU. I have prescribed, like, if they were on breast milk and if they were preemies, we would have a certain calculation to try to get them to meet their calorie goals, but we would always try to supplement the breast milk, like add this stinky powder to actual breast milk by having NICU moms pump and stuff. But I want to know what your experience was as a friend of mine in Z4 because I never talked to my patients' moms as it turned out.
Yes, so, Z4 had an unfortunate delivery, and we were in the NICU for quite a while. Both of us, it was just a traumatic experience, which honestly, I still haven't come to terms with. But alhamdulillah, he's a blessing and healthy and stuff now. But I was one of those, and again, I probably didn't have the typical NICU experience, and I really did produce milk before my kids were born. Like I
Lucky.
actually did. Which I mean, even my doctor's like, it's like 1% of people that do this, and I'm like,
Have
yeah,
this.
no, I have this issue. So we never had to actually supplement, but he was kept apart from me, just
Okay.
because they were healing. He was being healed, I was being healed, and every 90 minutes to 2 hours, I would be have to be wheeled into the NICU, and I insisted on putting him to the breast at that point. And then
Mm-hmm.
honestly, I would come back to my room and then pump
Mm-hmm.
just to ensure that my supply, because he wasn't next to me, I didn't have that typical um
The
in room
cues.
bonding experience that I had with my other 3 kids, and we were there for a long period of time. So I have to say it was actually work. It was literally work. I was recovering from a
Mm-hmm.
C-section, which and
Oh
obviously
gosh.
traumatized myself, having had major surgery and not being able to see my other 3 kids because they were not allowed to come to the hospital. So there was a lot of emotional back and forth. And again, to your point, I was very, very insistent that I breastfeed my kids. And even in the hospitals, they're not necessarily as supportive. Right. Because she
No.
was like,
Mm-mm.
it'll just be easier for you. You need to recover. Let me give the baby formula. Um, the few
Oh my
times when I
gosh.
really was just zonked out, I did pump enough, so they were able to give him pumped milk in a bottle. But honestly, I just didn't. We were there for such a long period of time. I didn't want him to get used to the bottle, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
So
Absolutely.
it was literally a full time job for me those first couple of days as I was recovering, and it was just such a traumatic experience for me that I just wanted to do whatever I could. It was a physical, tangible thing that I felt like I could do for him to help in the healing process, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I mean, typically those NICU moms are so emotionally exhausted. Forget about what they've
Yes.
physically gone through. And usually they do have other kids at home and they don't have the luxury of staying in the hospital. And I'm saying luxury as if it was luxurious for you. It probably
Right.
wasn't. But what I'm saying is that they had their C-section, they stayed there 72 hours, and now you're discharged. So you can either sleep in
Yeah,
the
no,
NICU or you can
I
go
was
home and take care of
able
your
t
family.
yeah, I was able because I was also recovering, because it was
Yeah.
just a very bad situation, so I was able to stay
Yeah.
with it, but I was in my patient care, and the
Hmm.
NICU was in a separate place. So the beauty is I
Hmm.
was able to stay on site, and I didn't have to go home because I wouldn't imagine if I was discharged and he was still there, how we would make that work, to be honest with
Yeah.
you.
And that's why I never got to talk to a lot of moms because they would send in with somebody. Some of these moms were going straight back to work. And
Yeah,
so they would send in all these, the tiny little bottles of
I
pumped
know.
breast milk. And then we would use that to help calculate, okay, how are we going to supplement this baby? And if we don't meet his demands, his physical demands, now we have to, put stinky formula in him, which I knew at least was going to sabotage their breastfeeding success when they got home. But the doctors, your focus in the NICU is getting that baby out of the NICU as fast as possible. So I always wondered, what happened to these kids when they went home and what happened to that breastfeeding dyad when they went home. Because I mean, that was my interest, was preserving the dyad. So I'm glad to know that despite all of those struggles that you guys did well because,
Yeah, we
you
did.
know, in all the cases that I know of, it didn't, those kids ended up on formula. And I'm not saying that like formula is all evil. I'm saying because breast milk is the standard, that's why um, uh, I say that. So tell me, Zeba, what were the most important factors in supporting your breastfeeding journey through all your kids?
Honestly, for me, it was, I know this is not going to be a popular answer. I was actually lazy. And let me
Tell me
explain
about
that. I
that.
didn't want to have to clean bottles and get up in the middle of the night. It was just so much easier. It's for me, it was easier to pull. I co-slept. I co-sleep a lot with my children. So like I co-slept the first probably 6 to 8 months, and I had a little bassinet that was attached to my bed. It was just a lot easier for middle of the night feedings for me to kind of like pull the baby to me versus getting up and warming the bottle and cleaning the bottles and the sterilizing the bottles. So counterintuitively, my laziness is what really was the biggest support for me because I just didn't want to have to do all that extra work, to be blunt with you. So that was really supportive. And honestly, my mom, even though at the time when we were born, it was actually not fashionable to nurse children, it was like more in
When we
fashion
were born, right? Yeah.
when we were born. It was the formula
Mhm.
was a new thing, and honestly like wealthier, quote unquote wealthier people fed their baby formula than not. And obviously we were not very wealthy at the time, so my mom had to nurse, and she was just actually very supportive um in that nursing process. She was like, you're doing what you need to do, and just get it done. And I have to say, like, for me, it was a blessing because I would be able to fall asleep. So I didn't necessarily feel that sleep deprivation um, as much as maybe another parent because I wasn't ever fully awake, if that makes sense.
No, it does, because breastfeeding actually releases your happy hormone, your natural oxytocin, and it induces sleep. So if you ever notice when you're feeding your baby, you have that heavy feeling and it really
Yes.
relaxes you. And I would end up falling asleep with my kids too, which is exactly what I needed after a 30-hour shift. Sometimes when I came home, it was like the best thing emotionally to meet my baby because I only ever saw him in the dark, right? I would pump five
Oh,
times, sometimes more a day. And there's so much discrimination that you deal with when you're a pumping mom at work,
yes.
especially in my field. So 10 years ago, and I think this statistic is still true, doctors who breastfeed their babies have a higher rate of attrition, which means dropping out of exclusive breastfeeding than Black teenage girls.
Oh,
So,
interesting.
it makes sense for those girls because they're young, they have very limited resources, they're in school all day. But for us too, there is discrimination, and I would say it's worse from women than it is from men. Um, so it was such a relief to be able to come home and have this baby who was like so excited to see me, who did get bottles during the day, but had no issue after a certain time. There was no what we call nipple confusion, but early on, he only had, we made sure that it was just breast. And then when I was going back to work, we started introducing bottles. And that is a challenge for a lot of women because they're like, how am I going to go back to work? My kid's not accepting a bottle. I promise
Yeah.
you, they won't starve. They'll eventually do it. One of my difficult situations was my daughter, who was exclusively breastfed, and she was the only one who refused a bottle. She wouldn't do it, and it's like
Really?
I'm going back to work in like 2 weeks, and we tried, and that kid wouldn't do it, and she refused to eat during the day. So it was literally when I came home. and
She
I
would
was a
just eat
fellow
and
at
get
the
all of
time.
her calories at
Yeah.
night.
So
Mhm.
what did she do? She stayed up all night long and would nurse every 2 hours, every 3 hours, and get her calories in that way. So that's called reverse cycle nursing. And it's hard, but it's not impossible. I went home one time. And this is why I know it didn't affect my sleep schedule, is because I went home and I would sleep with my mom in the master bedroom. We'd kick my dad out. And she was like, "Oh, how's your son doing? Does he wake up at night?" And I think he was like 8, 9 months old. And I was like, "Yeah, yeah. I mean, he sleeps through the night. Like he nurses at 9 and then he's done. I don't have to nurse him until 6 in the morning." And she's like, "Okay, great." So then in the morning, I wake up and I come to breakfast and she's like, "So your kid sleeps through the night, huh?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And she's like, "No, girl, he was up every 2 hours and you were snoring as he helped himself to the buffet." And I
That's
had
so funny.
no clue that this had been happening. I still don't know how long it had been going on. Like, I can't tell you.
But
So I'm a
the
deep
one thing
sleeper.
the one thing that people need to know, because I'd have some, you were talking about the support and some misinformation. The one thing somebody had mentioned to me was like, if I give my baby formula, they sleep through the night. I have to say, mine, minus my first, which I always say was my learning. I didn't
Test
know what
baby.
I was
Hmm.
due, my test baby. But
Hmm.
from Z2 to Z4, mine all slept through the night. And by sleeping through
Wow.
the night 10 to 12 hours, like I would do a dream feed at like
Oh.
10 and they would
Uh-huh.
sleep till 7. So it can be done,
Hmm.
and people need to be aware of that because mine were exclusively breastfed and slept, and they didn't even get food till probably 6 months, I would have to
Yeah.
say, like I started
Yeah.
on the solid food.
And that's what we want to do is probably, the national guidelines and the international guidelines for feeding a baby is wait until 6 months, exclusively breastfeed until then. And at that point, you can start your solids. And now there's a whole movement to introduce allergens early because people used to withhold
Yes.
peanut butter for some reason forever. And I was just looking at a meme this morning, like, don't put peanut butter on a spoon and give it to a baby. And I'm like, whoops, did that. They
Did you
all did
really?
okay. Yeah, but
Yeah,
it was
so
those plastic baby
the
spoons.
baby
That's all I
spoons.
gave them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we did talk about the Muslim mandate of nursing, and what
Yes.
is that for people that are not aware of the guidelines and the timelines for nursing your children in the Islamic tradition?
So I did mention at the beginning of the podcast that it's Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 233. And I think breast milk itself, that's where the 2-year mandate is coming in from
Right.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I took that very literally and I was like, Allah is telling me that I need to do this. And this is within my means of doing. Like, my body is able to do this. If it wasn't, he wouldn't tell me to do it. So I had said that to myself and dedicated myself to it. Now I know it's different for everybody, so whatever you do, that's fine, baby girl, do you. But I think breast milk is mentioned like another 6 or 7 times, but I couldn't tell you which verses in the Quran itself. So mother's milk is super important. And for those of us who are from subcontinental families, we know that we have to pay our mothers back the price of their milk, which, as we know, is priceless. So they will say, "I'm going to take the value of my milk from you." It's basically guilting you into doing stuff. And I remember one of the craziest things my mom ever said to me was, "Why are you spending so much time breastfeeding them? They're never going to remember this. Just stop. It's not worth it." All the kids, like, they sell you out and they leave, and she was at a time in her life, I guess. So I was like, I mean, I'm not doing this to keep some kind of a score with my kids. I'm doing it literally for the sake of Allah, and also because I believe in the science. And then she was like, "Okay, well, they're never going to remember." And I'm like, "That's not the point."
That, well, they don't remember a lot of things, but when they
They
become
don't.
parents, I think they do appreciate all the things that, like, when I became a parent, I definitely appreciated the sacrifices and all the things that my parents had to do in order to have us. So we don't always do things for our kids to pay us back later. Let's
Yeah,
just
that's not the
keep that
point of
there.
parenting.
That's not the
Yes,
point of
exactly.
parenting, everybody. But I do get your point. That is definitely a difference, I think, from the previous generation and our generation. Was like,
Hmm.
I know for me, my kids are not mine; they're their own people,
Hmm.
right?
They
So I
belong
have
to
them for
Allah.
such, they belong to God, and they're their own people, and I'm just here to kind of guide them on their way and hope and pray that they can pay it forward in the next generation. So
Yeah.
you talk a lot about like support. You're literally literally going and doing an internship for breastfeeding support for these women, like what kind of resources do people have when they tell you, they come to you as Dr. J and they're like, listen, I just cannot nurse, I'm not producing enough. What kinds of, where do you actually direct your patients for support, like tangible support for them?
I'll tell them to go to their doctor first because there's certain labs that can do it. I want to know what their birth history was. Did they have any birth trauma? Did they have a lot of medical interventions? Because certain drugs during your delivery can cause that. If you have any retained placenta, it can decrease your milk supply because that is it's actually telling your brain, hey, there's still baby in here, so don't make so much milk because that can actually, you know how they're like, don't do any nipple stimulation, it stimulates contractions while you're pregnant and stuff like that late in your pregnancy. So is that feedback loop. And so it's really important to start with a medical evaluation, but also I want to know, what is your baby? What are his hunger cues? Do you know his hunger cues? And a lot of times, first time moms don't.
Don't.
Um, yeah. And how are you feeding him? And what is your belief about what he needs? So if he's like sucking his thumb and like smacking or just awake, is that a sign to you that he needs to be fed? Or do you believe that that's a good time to pick him up and do some skin to skin and snuggle him, or just get your chores done, do whatever you got to do? Or do you believe that every time a baby's awake, he needs to be fed, which I think was something that I dealt with subcontinental moms who thought if a baby's awake, he's hungry.
Right.
So just beliefs, I think, about baby hunger, and then medical evaluations for perceived versus actual low supply.
Okay, got it. So you're saying sometimes people come to you because they assume it's a low supply, but really it's not.
Usually what they're doing is, oh, I wasn't making enough milk, so I started giving formula. Well, when the baby's full on formula, he's not going to suck on the milk.
And then
And
it
that's
becomes
what
like
ends
this
up.
negative,
And then, yeah,
essentially the cycle
yeah,
of feeding and then not getting, and then probably
yeah.
not even producing enough milk at that point.
Exactly. And then, babies they're lazy too, so if it's coming easily out of a nipple, they're going to suck more. And with my first one, I did do this. I was like, oh, he was the one that would take like 8 ounces in a feeding because I didn't know any better. And so we did the old school sticking a pin in the nipple of the
Oh
bottle
yeah,
so it
I
flows
actually none of
faster.
my kids yeah, none of my kids took a bottle. So like I haven't
Yeah.
had that experience, but like
Hmm.
is it just to make it like
Flow
bigger
faster.
presumably? Okay, flow
Yeah,
faster.
flow
Got it.
faster. And so I wasn't doing it. My mom did it. When she came on her visits, she graciously did that for me. She also graciously fed my first son his first food because she like was so excited. And I'm like,
Oh,
I
that's a
missed
not, but
that.
that is a nanny's blessing, right? Like they get very excited about that stuff.
Shut up, yo. I was so mad at her.
No, I'm like, there is that I always say, listen, there's that grandparent rights and responsibilities in the sense
Yeah.
that, I've stopped trying to argue. I'm just kind of like, I get
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
This is the stage of
Don't
your
fight that
life.
fight. Hmm.
You're going to be spoiling them and be fine with that. But like would have you, because you nursed all of your kids as well and obviously being
Hmm.
a breastfeeding advocate, have you received any negative pushback, and how do you respond to that when somebody comes to you and be like, why are you doing that, or why are you still
Yeah.
breastfeeding?
Yeah. Um, I was nursing my daughter at a party, and I remember the host was like, it was just women. And, in Islam, we have parts that we can show women and parts that we cannot. So, navel to knee, we're not allowed to show other women, but you can show your breasts to other women. And I think the wisdom in that in Islam is because we know everybody's going to be
We're going to be
breastfeeding.
free,
So,
exactly.
yeah, I used to be a real prude about it before I had kids. Like, oh my God, she's like, well, I can see. But then I was like, oh, well, what else is she going to do?
Yeah, I have
So
to feed my baby.
I have to feed the baby. Baby's hungry. But I had a nursing cover, and the hostess still told me, maybe you should go upstairs. And she was really nice about it, but I was like, oh my gosh, she's me before I had kids. But this is really funny because she actually has grown children. So whatever. I went
Oh.
upstairs. I'm sitting on the floor. I'm nursing my baby, and somebody walks in and is really startled. She's like, oh my gosh, I didn't know you were here. And then she's leaving and she goes, are you breastfeeding your baby? And I'm like, yeah. And she's like, but you're a doctor. And I'm like, yeah, That's why.
But I don't understand, what are the 2
It was what
things
you were
have to do with each other?
Yeah, it's what you said before because it was, formula feeding is associated with affluence, where we come from, right? Where
Got
our
it,
families
okay.
of origin come from. And she was from back home. And she thought, A, doctors should be too busy to breastfeed their children, and second, they should have enough money to be able to afford formula. And I don't care
Got
how
it.
much money you have. I'm not spending it like $50 on a box of formula. You crazy? Like, no way. I'm too cheap for that. So for you, you were saying you were too lazy to breastfeed. For
Yeah.
me,
No, I was
I
just
was too cheap. I
lazy.
was like, I'm not, or to formula feed. I was too cheap. Well, I'm not doing that. I
Yeah, I
got it for
wasn't
free
cheap, I
right
was just
here.
lazy. It was just it was for me, it's a pure laziness. No, and I
Yeah.
did nurse mine for long periods of time, obviously, and
Hmm.
they had teeth and they were talking and they would actually ask
Hmm.
for it because mine were early talkers on top of everything else. So then they
Perfect.
would literally ask for it. And sadly, my 6-year-old still talks about it like very lovingly and wishes we were
Mm,
still doing it. And I'm like, well, maybe I did nurse my babies for way too long. But yeah, I get that. Like, I think after a year, I think a lot of people get a little bit thrown
yeah.
off by it. And
How long
so
are you
then
going to
I
do
would,
it?
then I just, but at that point, honestly, it was just morning and night for me, anyways. It was
Hmm.
just more of a like continuation. They're growing, they're doing, eating other things. It was just more, and I realized I probably did that because I was kind of not ashamed, but I do feel like this external pressure to kind of wean that I
Mm.
just stopped telling people I was still nursing. Did you have
Oh.
that experience?
No, I'm totally shameless. Like my kids would walk up, flip my shirt up, and help themselves, and I didn't care. I would keep conversing, and people would be like, "This is weird," and I'm like, "No, you're weird, and your perception is weird. What my kid is doing is totally normal." Like,
They're
would
hungry. They want a
they're
snack.
hungry. Like, what do you want me to do? She's actually, no, she's not getting any nutrition. It's like BS. She is. There's still fat in here. She's getting it. She needs it. Her brain is growing. This is natural DHA happening. So leave my kid alone. If it makes you uncomfortable, then I'll cover up. But, I would have friends like challenging me to, you're not even making any milk. What are you doing? Like nursing a kid who's talking and walking. And I would prove them wrong. It's like, let me show you how far I can shoot. So.
So let me tell you this. Like, what do you think about extended breastfeeding?
Longer than 2 years?
Yes. For
Um,
somebody who's as big of an advocate as you are,
yeah.
like, what's your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are you should do what's right for your kid. Islamically, I would stop or try to stop around 2.5 if it's easy, if it can easily be done and very respectfully, positively be done with your child. My last one weaned at 2.5 because he was not letting go. But at that point, I was touched out. I really just wanted people off of my body.
Yeah.
And we managed to be able to do that. I know people go longer, and I'm totally fine with it. Like, do whatever you need to do, because guess what? Breastfeeding was like the best way to handle those terrible twos and threes because I could calm them down in like a second. And it got to the point where my husband, who was anti extended breastfeeding, would be like, shut him up, stick him on, you know?
Yeah.
So I'm all about whatever floats your boat because honestly, there's no kid who's still going to be breastfeeding in middle school, I promise you. So
Trust me,
it
they don't
really
even
doesn't
wanna
worry
sit
me.
next to
They
you
don't
in
want to.
public,
Yeah.
let alone doing that. But it's so funny because obviously I had my older 2, and then I had a break, and then I had my younger 2, so they got reintroduced to the whole concept of breastfeeding, and they were old enough to
Hmm.
understand, versus just kind of because I wasn't doing it, then I started doing it again. And actually, it's so funny, my daughter is gonna be so mad that I'm sharing this, but I would have to pump because I was actually so like, I just produced so much that it was just kind of painful, so I would pump after feedings, and she would
Hmm.
literally drink the breast milk from a cup.
A cup. Yeah.
But
Oh,
yeah, and
girl,
she
I
was
mixed
like,
it in
"It
so many
takes."
recipes.
Yeah, she was like, "It tastes like vanilla milk," and she loved it, and,
Yep.
so that's kind of where we're at. I do think, um, I'm a little bit less, I'm not as pro, like, anti-formula as maybe you as the doctor are, but I do think that, we've provided, some insight into what the different Islamic attitudes of what it is, and maybe there was some cultural baggage from when we were younger on the formula versus breast. And I think whatever you end up ultimately doing is the best thing for your child. And I think we're going to be posting some links and all that, and perhaps you'll share your journey when you go to Tanzania, Uzma.
Oh yeah, like I usually write up those international trips because there's so much to learn about the world. So yeah, our links will have breastfeeding duration recommendations. We have a La Leche League article on the Muslim perspective of breastfeeding. There's actually a lot of research done on exactly that, on Muslim perspectives on breastfeeding. And I've sat with Orthodox Jews, I've sat with like Orthodox Christians, and we've had these discussions. And we are really the only religion that has like an actual guideline on how long to do this, which is really good. The Academy of Breastfeeding Medicine, like they have all kinds of protocols on there. You can look them up for everything, y'all. Weaning, supplementation, even sleeping, all kinds of stuff. And you can get it free online. Those links are up there. And I think they're great because they're all backed by science too. So it's not a bunch of woo-woo, and it's really good stuff. And we will remember to put up the links to find your senators for November.
Yes, definitely. So
Well,
until
thanks
next
for
time,
joining us.
everybody, enjoy the weekend, and I hope you guys go out for your day of service. It's Martin Luther King Day on Monday. Do what you can in your communities, and we look forward to seeing you all next week, inshallah.
All right. Assalamu alaikum,
Okay,
everyone.
assalamu alaikum.